The hall was enormous. It was so large that the ceiling was invisible through the pale blue mist that floated near the top. Thousands of seats curved in wide circles around a single central platform, and on that platform stood a small human woman in a gray coat. Her name was Alara Voss, and she was the last human ambassador to the Conclave of Sovereign Worlds. She had been standing there for 6 minutes. Nobody had asked her to stand. She simply chose to, because sitting felt too much like waiting, and she was done waiting. Around her, 200 species filled the chamber. There were tall, thin creatures with 4 arms and silver skin. There were wide, heavy beings that moved on 6 legs and communicated through vibrations in the floor. There were species so ancient that their translators were older than most human cities. They talked, argued, gestured, and buzzed among themselves, and none of them paid Alara much attention. That was the problem. That had always been the problem. The vote had just ended. The result glowed in pale red letters on the central display above the platform. 312 votes against, 41 in favor. The Kepler Corridor neutral zone request was denied. Again. For the 3rd time in 4 years. Alara looked at the result for a long moment. She did not look angry. She did not look sad. She looked like someone who had already made peace with something a long time ago, and was simply watching the last step of a process reach its natural end. Archon Surel of the Thalvari moved toward the speaker's platform. He was tall and thin, with pale green skin that shimmered faintly under the chamber lights. He was the lead mediator of the conclave, and he had held that position for over 90 years. He was very good at sounding reasonable while doing nothing. "The motion is denied," he said in a calm voice. "The Kepler Corridor remains under shared galactic jurisdiction. The Terran Confederation's request has been noted and filed for future review." Future review. Alara had heard that phrase so many times it had lost all meaning. She stepped off the platform without speaking and walked back to the small human delegation box near the eastern wall. Her assistant, a young man named Patel, handed her a cup of something warm without being asked. He had worked with her long enough to know when she needed it. "Same result," he said quietly. "Same result," she agreed. She sat down and pulled out her communication device. The encrypted channel to Earth's unified command was already open. She had prepared a message earlier, one she had hoped she would not need to send. She looked at it now. It was short. "They won't move. Not even an inch." She sent it. Then she waited. In the seats around the human delegation box, other ambassadors were already moving on to the next item of business. Nobody came to offer sympathy. Nobody came to explain their vote. 3 years ago, a few of them might have, but that was 3 years ago. The Drell ambassador, a round creature with enormous dark eyes, glanced at Alara as he passed. He said nothing, but there was something in that glance. Not quite guilt. Something smaller. The kind of look a person gives when they know they made a small wrong choice, but have decided not to think about it. Alara watched him go. In the back corridors of the conclave building, away from the main chamber, 2 senior Thalvari officials were speaking in low voices. They did not know that the translation device on the wall behind them was still active, or that it was connected to the human delegation's monitoring system. "They will complain again next cycle," one of them said. "They always do," the other replied. "Humans and their fairness. It is almost sweet. They have 41 votes. They cannot block anything, cannot pass anything, cannot do anything without us." Exactly. So they will keep coming back, because what else would they do? Leave? Both of them made a sound that served as laughter in their language. Patel was listening through his earpiece. He glanced at Alara. She already knew. She had known for years. She just needed to hear it said out loud so that it could be part of the official record. 6 hours later, the response from Earth arrived. Alara opened it in private, in the small room the conclave provided for human delegation use. It was a plain room. A table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out over the silver rooftops of Vethkara Prime's capital city. She had spent a great deal of time in this room over the years. She had written reports here, prepared arguments here, rehearsed speeches here that she had believed, at the time, might change something. The message from Unified Command was 2 words, followed by a code designation. Omega Protocol. She sat with it for a moment. She breathed. Then she closed the message and stood up. She found Patel in the outer room and told him to begin packing everything. Every document, every device, every small personal item that had accumulated over the years. She told him to have it all moved to the transport by morning. He looked at her. He understood immediately. He did not ask questions. The next morning, Ilara Voss walked into the main chamber of the Conclave of Sovereign Worlds for the last time. The session had just opened. 200 species sat in their curved seats. The great mist floated near the ceiling. The central display glowed softly. She walked to the central platform. Archon Su-Rel noticed her. He frowned slightly, because she was not scheduled to speak. But before he could say anything, she placed her diplomatic credentials on the platform surface. A flat, silver card embedded with the seal of the Terran Confederation. She set it down carefully, the way a person sets down something they will not be picking up again. Then she spoke. Her voice was clear and calm. The chamber translators carried it to every species in the room in their own language. The Terran Confederation withdraws from all diplomatic engagement with the Conclave of Sovereign Worlds, effective immediately. The chamber went very still. We will not be returning to this table. No anger. No raised voice. No list of grievances. She had written a longer speech. She had decided not to use it. There was nothing left to explain. She stepped off the platform and walked toward the exit. 200 species watched her go. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke. The silence in that enormous hall was the loudest thing Ilara Voss had ever heard. Archon Su-Rel stood at the front of the chamber with his mouth slightly open. Around him, the assembled representatives of 200 worlds turned to look at one another. Nobody knew what to say, because nobody had prepared for this. In 4,000 years of conclave history, no species had ever simply walked away. There was no protocol for it. There was no rule that prevented it. There was only the slow, cold understanding beginning to spread through the room, quiet as a shadow moving across the floor, that something had just changed, and that they had no idea what it would cost them. The first sign came from the freight companies. It was small at first. A few large cargo vessels that regularly moved goods through the Kepler corridor failed to depart on schedule. Port administrators sent standard delay inquiries. The inquiries were answered politely and promptly. The ships, they were told, were docked for maintenance and crew review. There was no estimated time of departure. The port administrators filed the responses and moved on. Delays happened. It was not unusual. But then more ships stopped. Not just in the Kepler corridor. Across 6 major trade routes, human-operated freight vessels quietly docked, powered down their transit drives, and went still. No emergencies were reported. No mechanical failures were declared. The crews were on board. The ships were in perfect condition. They simply did not move. By the 3rd day, the Drell merchant guilds sent an urgent communication to the Conclave emergency desk. By the 5th day, that desk was overwhelmed. Archon Su-Rel stood in his private office on the 42nd floor of the Conclave Tower and looked at the reports stacking up on his display. His assistant read them aloud, because Su-Rel found the sound of bad news easier to process than the sight of it. 34% of interspecies cargo movement through the known lanes had slowed or stopped. Human freight vessels represented that share almost entirely. Without them, goods were sitting in port. Food supplies for 3 colony worlds in the outer rings were delayed. Medical equipment bound for the Veth secondary hospitals had not moved in 4 days. Industrial components needed for the hegemony's new construction platforms were stranded on a dock in Kepler Station 7. "This is a disruption tactic," Su-Rel said flatly. His assistant hesitated. "It may be, Archon. Or it may simply be that the vessels are privately owned, and the crews are within their rights choosing not to work. That is a disruption tactic. Yes, Archon. But it is also entirely legal." Su-Rel was quiet for a moment. "What about the relay stations?" The assistant's face shifted in a way that was not reassuring. 3 of the deep-range FTL relay stations on the southern corridor have gone offline. The humans built them and maintain the operating licenses. They have submitted formal notices citing scheduled maintenance. All 3 at the same time. Yes. Surel turned to look out his window. The capital city of Vethkara Prime stretched below him in pale geometric patterns. It was a very old city. He had watched it from this window for most of his adult life, and it had always looked orderly and permanent. Right now it looked fragile. On the other side of the galaxy, in the council chambers of the Drell merchant guilds, a room full of small gray creatures in expensive coats were shouting at each other. Their 3 primary shipping lanes ran directly through the relay station network the humans had built. Without the navigational support from those stations, long-distance travel on those lanes became dangerous. It was not impossible. It was just the kind of dangerous that insurance companies refused to cover and captains refused to accept. Their economy had been bleeding since day 2. By day 6, it was a serious wound. The guildmaster, an elderly Drell named Ocean Var, sat at the head of the table and did not shout. He was past shouting. He had already sent 2 messages to the Terran Confederation's primary contact point, a communications office on a human colony called Meridian Station. Both messages had been received. Neither had been answered. That was, he thought, the most alarming part of all of it. Not the silence itself, but how clean it was. Humans had not gone dark in anger. They were not raging. They were not threatening. They had simply redirected their attention to something else. And in doing so, they had made the rest of the galaxy understand for the first time, clearly and painfully, that human attention had been a gift, not an obligation. On the 7th day, Grand Arbiter Mach Thane called a closed session of the Conclave's inner council. He was very old, even by the standards of long-lived species. His skin was the deep gray of cold stone, and his eyes were a pale amber that had seen 4,000 years of galactic politics. He had managed crises before. He was not a man who panicked, but he was a man who prepared. And right now, his preparation had a large and inconvenient hole in it. He let the other council members speak first. He always did. He found it useful to know which of them would catastrophize and which would minimize before he offered any analysis of his own. The representative from the hegemony trade bloc insisted the humans were bluffing and would return within a month. The representative from the Veth Biological Consortium said the medical supply delays were already serious and becoming critical. The Thalvari contingent, Surel among them, maintained that the situation was manageable and that back-channel communication would resolve it soon. Mach Thane listened to all of it. Then he spoke. Pull every economic and infrastructure assessment we have on Terran contributions to the Conclave framework, he said. Not trade statistics. Everything. Engineering contracts. Maintenance licenses. Mediation records. Medical supply agreements. All of it. The room was quiet. We voted against them 3 times, he continued. In 4 years, we denied them a neutral zone, the size of a minor trade district. Before I decide how to respond to this withdrawal, I want to know exactly what we traded for that decision. It took his analysts 18 hours to compile the full report. When it arrived on his desk, Mach Thane read it alone. He did not call anyone in to read it aloud. It was not comfortable reading. Human engineers had designed and built 62% of the deep-range FTL relay network. Human medical firms supplied baseline pharmaceutical compounds to 41 species, many of whom had no alternate source. Human mediators had quietly resolved 19 interspecies disputes over the past century disputes that the official conclave record showed as self-resolved. Human freight infrastructure touched, in some form, nearly every major trade route in the known lanes. None of this had been advertised. None of it had been leveraged. Humans had simply done it, year after year, because it needed to be done, and they were capable of doing it. Mach Thane set the report down. He thought about the 2 Thalvari officials in the back corridor, the ones who had laughed about humans and their fairness. He thought about the vote, 312 against. He thought about Ilara Voss placing her credentials on the platform and walking away without raising her voice. He understood now what she had understood when she sent that final message to Earth. They had not been holding a weak position. They had been holding back. He called his intelligence director and gave a quiet order. He wanted eyes inside human space. Not military surveillance. Just observers. He wanted to know what humans were doing now, that they had stopped doing everything else. The answer, when it came back 2 weeks later, would keep him awake for 3 nights in a row. The intelligence observer's name was Venshari. She was Thalvari, small and quick, trained in deep cover work, fluent in 6 languages, including 2 human dialects. She had operated in difficult environments before. She knew how to watch without being seen, and how to read a situation without asking questions that might reveal her purpose. She arrived at the edge of human space through a commercial transit point, using a merchant identity that had passed inspection dozens of times before. She spent 3 weeks moving through human colony worlds and station ports, watching, listening, filing reports back to Mokthane through a channel so encrypted it would take 100 years to crack by standard methods. Her first report was short. Human space is not in chaos. I repeat, it is not in chaos. It is the opposite of chaos. I don't have a better word for what I'm seeing. I'll try to describe it. Her second report was longer. Every port she visited was active. Construction platforms were running around the clock. New relay infrastructure was going up, at a pace she found difficult to believe given the scale of the work involved. Cargo routes were busy, not the interspecies routes, which were still quiet, but internal human routes, moving materials from one colony to another. Whatever they were building, they were moving the pieces for it constantly. But the most striking thing was not the activity. It was the people. She had expected to find a population under stress. She had expected tension, maybe fear, maybe the quiet resentment of a people who had made a dramatic choice and were now living with the consequences. She had been prepared for that. She knew how to read stress in humans. She had studied them for years. What she found instead was something she had no training for. They were fine, more than fine, in the common areas of transit stations, in the open market sections of colony ports, in the small eating establishments where workers gathered during rest shifts. Humans were calm. They talked and argued and laughed the way they always did. There was no rationing, no visible hardship. If anything, there was an energy she could only describe as relief, as if something heavy had been put down, as if a long, uncomfortable wait had finally ended and people could get back to real work. She filed that report and sat with the discomfort of it for a day before she understood why it bothered her so much. She had assumed the withdrawal was a gamble, a desperate move by a frustrated species. She had assumed humans needed the conclave and were punishing themselves to punish the council. But they didn't look like people who were punishing themselves. They looked like people who had quit a job that was wasting their time and gone home to build something better. Her third report detailed the military situation, which she had saved until she had enough context to frame it properly. Human defense fleets were repositioning. Not mobilizing for war, she was careful to be clear about that distinction. There was no troop buildup on border worlds. No weapon system activation protocols running. No target selection activity in their communications that she could detect. What was happening was more like a reorganization. Ships were being stationed at key corridor points, with clear, logical coverage patterns. It was the movement of a species setting up a proper fence, not preparing to attack a neighbor. She filed this report and received a response from Mokthane directly, which was unusual. He asked one question. What does it look like they're preparing for? She thought about it for 2 days before answering. Independence. Complete, long-term independence. They are not preparing for war. They are preparing to not need anyone. 2 weeks after Venshari sent that report, the hegemony made its move. The hegemony was a block of 7 industrial species who had been eyeing the resource deposits in the outer Kepler corridor for years. In the past, human diplomatic pressure at the conclave had kept them at bay. With the humans gone from the council and their fleet positions appearing to be purely defensive, the hegemony leadership concluded that the moment had come. 7 mining vessels crossed into the outer Kepler corridor. They were accompanied by 2 armed escort ships, which was unusual for mining operations and not subtle. They began preliminary survey operations on an asteroid cluster that sat well within the boundaries that humanity had defined as sovereign colonial space. They received no response for 6 hours. Then 3 Terran Defense Fleet destroyers arrived. They did not fire. They did not jam communications. They moved into a clear holding position between the hegemony fleet and the asteroid cluster, and they broadcast a single short message on an open frequency that every ship in the region could hear. You are in Terran sovereign space. You have 4 hours to leave under your own power. This message will not be repeated. That was all. No legal threats. No reference to the conclave. No request for negotiation. Just a clock and a fact. The hegemony escort ships powered up their weapon systems. For approximately 3 minutes, the situation was on the edge of something very bad. The Terran destroyers did not react to the weapon activation. They did not adjust their position. They did not power up their own weapon systems in response. They simply stayed where they were, patient and absolute, like a wall that had decided it was a wall and had nothing more to discuss. The hegemony fleet commander later reported that the thing which made him order the retreat was not the firepower of the 3 destroyers. It was that calm, that complete and total lack of urgency. The humans were not bluffing, and they were not afraid, and they were not even particularly angry. They were simply certain. Certainty, the commander decided, was more frightening than rage. The hegemony fleet left. No shots were fired. When the report of the incident reached Mach Thane, he read it twice. Then he called in his senior advisor, a long-serving Veth official named Dara Keese, and he told her to close the door. "They're not coming back," he said. Dara Keese had worked with him for 40 years. She chose her words carefully. "We don't know that yet." "I know it," he said. He pushed the incident report across the desk toward her. "Look at the response time. Look at the message. They have standing patrol positions in that corridor already." This was not a reaction. It was a prepared response. He paused. They planned for this. Not the hegemony incident specifically. The whole situation. They knew this was coming before they walked out of the chamber. Dara Keese looked at the report. She was quiet for a long moment. "Then Voss's withdrawal wasn't the beginning," she said slowly. "No," Mach Thane said. "It was the last step of something they started building long before she ever put those credentials on the platform." He stood and moved to the window. "We spent 2 centuries studying human warfare. We built threat assessments, weapon comparisons, tactical analyses." He was quiet for a moment. "We never once studied what would happen if they simply stopped cooperating." Outside his window, 3 freighters from the Drell merchant guilds sat idle in the port below. They had been sitting there for a month. They would keep sitting there until new navigation infrastructure was in place on the southern corridor, infrastructure that the Conclave did not have the engineers to build quickly. Somewhere across the galaxy, humans were building something. Mach Thane was beginning to understand that by the time the Conclave figured out exactly what it would already be finished. The broadcast came on a Tuesday morning by Earth's calendar, though for most of the galaxy it arrived in the middle of whatever their equivalent of night was. It did not matter. People woke up for it. Port operators left their consoles and gathered around shared screens. Ambassadors were pulled from their beds by frantic assistants. In the Conclave Tower on Veth Kara Prime, Archon Surel was still pulling on his formal coat when his aide turned up the volume. The signal was clean, clear, and strong enough to reach every inhabited system in the known lanes simultaneously. Humans had been building a new deep-range transmission network for weeks. Now the galaxy understood what it was for. Alara Voss appeared on screen. She was not standing in a grand hall. She was not dressed in ceremonial clothes. She sat at a plain table in what looked like a working office, with star maps visible on the wall behind her. She looked exactly like what she was. A person with work to do, and something important to say before she got back to it. She spoke for 11 minutes. She called it the Terran Compact. She described it in plain, clear terms. It was an independent alliance, open to any world or species willing to operate outside the Conclave's framework. Member worlds would have equal standing regardless of size, population, or economic weight. No single member could block the votes of others, simply by being larger or older. Disputes would go to neutral arbitration, not political committees where the powerful could stall indefinitely. Infrastructure, the relay stations, the freight routes, the medical supply networks, would be shared equally among members, not held as leverage. She did not spend time criticizing the Conclave. She did not list grievances or deliver accusations. She simply described what the compact was, and in describing it, she let the contrast speak for itself. By the time the broadcast ended, the communications desk at the conclave was already receiving signals from 3 different species, requesting clarification on the compact's membership terms. By the end of that day, it was 12. The first full member to sign was a small world called Pethvi, home to a quiet, agricultural species that had been a conclave member for 200 years, and had spent most of that time having their trade requests delayed and their complaints filed away for future review. Their ambassador signed the compact charter without ceremony and sent a 1-sentence notification to the conclave. We have found a better arrangement. The second was a mining collective in the outer rings, whose entire transport system had been dependent on human freight operators. They signed because they had seen what cooperation with humans actually looked like when it wasn't filtered through conclave bureaucracy, and it looked like reliability. The third, fourth, and fifth came in quick succession over the following 2 days, and each one added pressure to the next, because each signature made the compact look more real, and the conclave's silence look more like helplessness. Surel requested an emergency session. He called the compact an illegal secession from established galactic order. He used the phrase, destabilizing unilateral action, 4 times in his opening statement. The response from Alara Voss came the same afternoon, broadcast on the same wide-range signal as the original charter. The Terran Confederation was a member of the conclave, she said. Not a territory, not a dependent. A voluntary member. Members may leave. The right to leave was written into the original conclave founding documents by the species that created it. If Archon Surel disagrees, we invite him to read the document he was appointed to uphold. Surel did not respond publicly. Privately, his legal team confirmed that she was correct. Mokthane watched all of this without comment. He had moved past the phase of looking for legal angles. He was watching the compact grow, and he was watching the shape of it with the careful attention of someone who had spent 4,000 years understanding how power moved. What he saw was not a rebellion, it was a replacement. The compact was not trying to destroy the conclave. It was building a parallel structure that would, over time, simply make the conclave less relevant. Every species that joined took some part of the conclave's economic weight with them. Every relay station the humans brought online for compact members was one more node that the conclave did not control. It was patient, structural, and almost elegant in its deliberateness. Then came the moment that proved the compact had real teeth. A conclave trade enforcement vessel attempted to intercept a compact supply convoy on the southern transit lane. The convoy was carrying medical materials from a human pharmaceutical facility to 3 newly joined compact worlds. The enforcement vessel broadcast a hold order, citing a conclave regulation requiring inspection of goods moving through shared transit space. The convoy did not stop. Its escort, 2 Terran defense ships, and 1 vessel from a compact member species kept moving at standard transit speed. The enforcement vessel broadcast the hold order twice more. The convoy acknowledged the transmission politely and continued moving. The enforcement vessel moved into the lane ahead of the convoy. It was a direct block. For approximately 4 minutes, the convoy reduced speed. There were people in the conclave monitoring center who later said those 4 minutes felt much longer. Then the escort ships moved forward, closed to a short distance from the enforcement vessel, and broadcast a simple message. You are blocking a medical supply convoy on a transit lane that is not under conclave jurisdiction. Move your vessel, or we will note this as an act of hostile interference in our official record and act accordingly. You have 2 minutes. The enforcement vessel moved. No shots. No damage. But the message was clear to everyone watching. The compact would not yield on principle, and it had the ability to back that up. Inside the conclave, the reaction was not anger. It was fear, which was different and harder to manage. Admiral Cassian Reese, head of Terran Defense, watched the footage of the transit lane standoff from his desk at Terran Command Headquarters. He was a broad, gray-haired man who had commanded ships for 30 years and had the habit of sitting very still when he was thinking hard. He sat still for a long time after watching it. He called Alara Voss on a secure channel. They'll push harder next time, he said. I know, she said. Are we ready for that? She was quiet for a moment. We're ready to not blink. Whether they push to actual force. She paused. That depends on whether Mach Thane is as smart as I think he is. Reese considered that. And if he's not? Then we'll find out what we're really made of, she said simply. But my guess is he's smart enough to know that a war with us, right now, while the Compact is growing, and half the galaxy is watching, that's not a war the Conclave wins. Even if they have more ships. She was right about one thing. Mach Thane had already done that calculation. He had done it 3 times, from 3 different angles, and he got the same answer each time. He sat alone in his office for a long time that night. Then he made a decision that no Grand Arbiter of the Conclave of Sovereign Worlds had made in 4,000 years of recorded history. He was going to go and speak to the humans himself, not through channels, not through intermediaries. He was going to go to them, on their ground, and he was going to do it because it was the only move he had left that did not end in something that nobody could walk back from. He began preparing for the journey without announcing it. He told almost nobody. What he told his staff was that he was taking a private diplomatic trip for health reasons. His staff, who had known him for decades, did not believe him for a second. They packed his bags and arranged his transport and said nothing, because that too was part of what working for Mach Thane required. The Grand Arbiter was going to meet the humans, and for the first time in his very long life, he had no idea how the meeting would go. Meridian Station sat at the edge of Terran space like a quiet landmark. It was not a military installation. It was not a grand diplomatic facility. It was a working transit station, mid-sized, functional, built for cargo transfers and crew rest, and the ordinary business of keeping colonies connected. The corridors smelled of machine oil and coffee, and the observation deck looked out over a stretch of open space that was, depending on which maps you consulted, either the boundary of human territory or the beginning of unclaimed lanes. Humans had chosen it for that reason. The message in the choice was not subtle. Mach Thane arrived with a small entourage. He had left behind the ceremony and the formal escort that usually accompanied a Grand Arbiter on official visits. He brought 4 advisors, 2 security personnel, and a translator, even though his own grasp of human language was more than sufficient. The translator was there to make sure nothing was misunderstood. On this particular visit, he could not afford misunderstandings. The docking bay was clean and well lit, no banners, no honor guard. 2 human officials in working clothes met them at the airlock and introduced themselves briefly. One was an aide to Admiral Reese. The other was a logistics coordinator for the station. They were polite, efficient, and entirely without ceremony. Mach Thane found this more unsettling than an aggressive greeting would have been. He was shown to a conference room on the station's mid-level. It had a long table, plain chairs, a wide window looking out at stars, and a pot of something hot that one of the human aides explained was tea, available if he wanted it. He did not want it, but he appreciated being offered. Alara Voss arrived 7 minutes later, with Admiral Cassian Reese beside her. They sat across the table. No performance, no preamble. Alara folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the same calm, steady expression. He had studied in recordings of her conclave withdrawal, the expression of someone who had made peace with where things stood and did not need the other person to validate it. Mach Thane had prepared an opening. He had practiced it. It was measured, dignified, and positioned the conclave as a reasonable institution seeking a reasonable outcome with a valued partner. He looked at Alara Voss and realized his opening was wrong for the room. He set it aside and spoke plainly. "We made errors," he said. "I am here because I believe those errors can still be addressed, if both sides are willing." Alara did not respond immediately. She reached to the side and brought a flat case onto the table, opened it, and removed a document. A physical document, printed on paper, which Mach Thane found momentarily strange until he understood the choice. Paper could not be altered after the fact. Paper was permanent in a way digital records, however encrypted, were not. She slid it across the table to him. He looked at it. It was a ledger. Columns and rows of figures, dates, and descriptions. He recognized the format. His own analysts used similar documents. He began reading. It was a complete accounting of every significant contribution the Terran Confederation had made to the conclave of sovereign worlds over 200 years. Engineering contracts, relay station construction, maintenance agreements, mediation services, provided at no cost to the conclave record, medical supply agreements, freight infrastructure development, emergency assistance provided during 3 interspecies crises that the official conclave history credited to collective action. Every line had a date. Every contribution had a value. And beside each one, in a second column, was a corresponding record of what humanity had requested from the conclave in the same period. The second column was much shorter. Not because humans had asked for little, because most of what they had asked for had been denied. Mockthane read through the document slowly. His advisors were quiet. Ilara and Reese were quiet. The station hummed softly around them. He came to the last entry. It was the Kepler Corridor Neutral Zone request. 3 votes, 3 denials. The dates were precise. Below the final denial was a single line. Vote to withdraw. Passed unanimously by Terran Unified Command. Date of execution. The day of Ambassador Voss's final appearance before the conclave. He set the document down. He thought about what to say. He thought about the 4,000 years of history behind his position. He thought about the weight of representing 200 species, the complexity of balancing competing interests, the reality that in a body of that size, small members were always at risk of being treated as background. He thought about all of that. And then he thought about the 2 officials in the back corridor who had laughed about humans and their fairness. Ilara spoke before he could find the right words. "Did we matter to you, Arbiter?" Her voice was quiet. Not angry. Not bitter. Just direct, in the way of a person asking a question they actually want answered. Or only what we carried. The room was very still. Mockthane had governed for 4,000 years. He had navigated wars, collapses, crises, betrayals, and the slow grinding work of keeping an enormous and fractious civilization from tearing itself apart. He had never been asked a question quite like that, and he discovered, sitting in that plain room on a mid-level deck of a working station at the edge of human space, that he did not have an answer he was proud of. "I think," he said carefully, "that the conclave treated your contributions as infrastructure and your requests as inconvenience. I think that was wrong. And I think the people responsible for that did not understand what they were risking because they had never been asked to imagine the cost." It was not an apology. Not quite. But it was honest. And Ilara Voss had spent enough years in diplomatic rooms to know the difference between honesty and performance. She nodded once. "Then here is where we are," she said. "The Terran Confederation will not return to the conclave as a member. That door is closed. What is open is this. The conclave may apply for access to compact infrastructure, trade access, relay network access, and freight route cooperation, on terms set by the compact, reviewed annually, and cancelable by either party with 90 days' notice." She paused. "Equal terms. No exceptions for size or seniority. No veto rights. No preferential treatment in either direction." Mockthane looked at her. Then he looked at Admiral Reese, who had not spoken once during the entire meeting and had not needed to. His presence said everything that needed to be said about the other dimension of this conversation. "And the compact itself?" Mockthane asked. "Will continue to grow," Ilara said. "We are not asking for your permission, and we are not asking you to endorse it. We are simply telling you that it exists, and that we are open to a working relationship rather than a hostile one." There was a long pause. "That is not the reunion I came here to propose," Mockthane said. "I know," Ilara said. "But it is the one we are offering." He thought about refusing. He thought about leverage and pressure, and the long game of diplomatic maneuvering. He thought about all the tools he had used for 4,000 years to bring reluctant parties back to the table. And then he thought about those 3 destroyers in the Kepler corridor, sitting patient and still in front of the hegemony fleet. He thought about the compact's 12 members becoming 15, becoming 20. He thought about the transit lane standoff and the conclave enforcement vessel that had quietly moved aside. He thought about Vencheri's report. They are preparing to not need anyone. I will take the proposal back to the Conclave Inner Council, he said. That's all we asked, Alara said. The meeting ended without ceremony, the same way it had begun. Mokthane's entourage was escorted back to the docking bay. His shuttle undocked smoothly and pulled away from Meridian Station into open space. He sat in the forward cabin and watched the station shrink through the porthole until it was just a small light among many. His senior aide, Darachus, sat beside him. After a while, she asked the question he had known she would ask. Did it go well? He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the porthole, the stars moved slowly as the shuttle adjusted its heading for the long journey home. We spent 2 centuries studying human warfare, he said finally. We built threat models and weapon assessments and tactical simulations. We asked every question about what humans would do if they decided to fight us. He paused. We should have spent that time studying human patience. Darachus said nothing. There was nothing useful to add. Back on Meridian Station, Alara Voss stood at the observation deck window and watched the shuttle's engine trail fade into the dark. Reese stood beside her. He'll bring it to the council, Reese said. Yes, she said. And they'll argue about it for months. Yes, she said again. They will. She watched the last of the light disappear. That's fine. We have work to do in the meantime. She turned away from the window and walked back toward the working part of the station, toward the maps and the schedules and the 1,000 small tasks that building something new and real required. There was no celebration in her step, no relief, exactly. Just the steady, purposeful movement of someone who had finished one thing and had a great deal more still to do. The conclave of sovereign worlds would argue and deliberate, and eventually, probably, accept the terms. Or it would not, and the compact would continue growing without it. And in 20 years the question of conclave relevance would answer itself. Either way, humanity had already made its choice. They had come to the galaxy in good faith, offered their work, asked for fairness, and been ignored. They had waited, and tried, and waited again, and finally set down something they should have set down years before. And then they had gotten back to building. That was, in the end, the most human thing about all of it. Not the withdrawal. Not the compact. Not the destroyers in the corridor, who did not blink. The fact that the moment the decision was made, they stopped looking backward entirely. There was too much ahead of them to waste time on what was behind.